Today we're going to learn about how to replace some brake lines. Pretty much any American or foreign car. This will be 3/16 brake lines. We're going to learn about the difference between a double flare, also known as an inverted flare, and a bubble flare, and the different fittings, couplings, unions that go with those. There's a lot of videos out there that show you how to make the various flares on the tubing, but there's not many videos out there that talk about which fittings will work with which and all the little intricacies of that. So I'm going to discuss that today. I'm not an expert. I've learned all this in the last 3 or 4 days, but kind of like staying at a Holiday Inn Express. So that's what you're dealing with, but I think it's some useful information. When you're talking about automotive flared fittings, there's basically 3 types. The first is a single flare, never to be used on brake lines. Single flares are often used on low pressure lines such as fuel pressure lines or transmission lines, but single flare should never be used on brake lines. The other common flare found on automotive vehicles is the double flare, also called the inverted flare. This flare is very durable because basically it has double the wall thickness, because first you flare a bubble and then you use a cone to press that bubble in on itself. You end up with a double wall thickness that is very durable. Here you can see the difference between a single and a double flare. Again, single flare never to be used on brake lines. Double flares can be used on brake lines. The other very common fitting used on automotive brakes is a bubble flare. This is typically found on foreign cars, first of all. The bubble fitting is also called a DIN or an ISO fitting. The bubble flare can be seen here in a cutaway view. What's the difference between ISO and DIN? Basically, ISO and DIN are the same thing. Here's a little bit more on that if you really want to get down to the nuts and bolts of it, but essentially for our purposes, ISO and DIN are the same thing. And you're going to talk about ISO and DIN when you're talking about bubble flares. Here's a shot of a typical inverted double flare on the left with a standard SAE fitting that's a 3/8 times 24 thread. Then on the right you've got a metric fitting, which is an M10 times 1.0, and it's got the bubble flare shown with it. Note that the metric fitting has a green color and it is not fully threaded. So the threads don't go all the way to the end, which creates this non-threaded tip, or sometimes called an extended tip. The standard SAE double flare or inverted flare fittings were used on American cars from forever ago up until around 1995. There's no definite date, things kind of overlap, but starting at about 1995 you started to see American cars starting to use the metric fittings and also the bubble flares. When you talk about brake line, we're talking about 3/16 inch brake line today. 3/16 of an inch is also 4.75 millimeters. So the SAE American brake lines 3/16 and the metric 4.75 are actually the same thing, the same outside diameter. So they can be interchanged. So you're going to use a 3/16 inch brake line with a metric fitting. Here's another shot of an ISO bubble flare and also of a SAE double flare. Note that the double flare has a bit of an inverted backside to it, and that's because you crush it down into a cone-shaped die. The bubble flare on the right has more of a flat back on it, because that is typically crushed against a flat surface rather than being crushed into a cone-shaped die. There's quite a bit of information on this slide, so I'll just let you read it for a second. You can get a double flaring kit, would be called SAE, or a bubble flaring kit, which would be called ISO. Both are available, so if you want to use one or the other, it would make sense to get either both of them or the one that you're going to use the most. The good thing is that these are fairly cheap, about 30 bucks a piece, and also most of the auto stores will loan you these things for no cost. Okay, what you're looking at here is a standard 3/8 inch times 24 fully threaded male nut. It's intended for use with SAE double flares, also called inverted flares. Although it's still widely used, most cars are now switching over to the metric style. These SAE fully threaded nuts are only used with the double flare and will not work correctly with a bubble flare. Be careful, as the metric and the American SAE nuts will tend to start in each other's fittings, but the threads are not the same, and if you force them in there, you're going to mess the threads up, cause yourself a lot of trouble. Note here is a picture of a metric nut. It's a 10mm times 1.0 fine threaded metric nut. This nut works fine with both SAE double flare and also the DIN ISO bubble flares. Note this nut has the extended tip, so the threads don't go all the way to the end. You'll see why in a second here. First, this is a SAE double flare, also called an inverted flare. What's shown on the right is the process of making that double flare. This is the first step, where you've got a little bit of tube sticking up above the plate. Then you take a die and you force it down over that tube and you bend it into basically a bubble shape. That's step one. Step two is you remove that die, then you force that 45-degree cone down into the bubble, and that gives it that angle. Here's another diagram showing the basic steps of creating a double flare. Again, tube sticking up, force it down with a die to create sort of a bubble, and then force the cone into it to fold those walls in and create a double wall thickness there at the mating surface. Here's another diagram showing the step-by-step process. This is a diagram that you find in one of the kits that you would buy or rent or loan. Here's a cutaway view of an SAE fitting on the left that is meant to accept a double flare. The fitting on the right is for a bubble fitting. You can see that the seats are much different. You might be able to get away with crushing a bubble into an inverted flare fitting, although it's not a good idea. However, trying to do the reverse is not going to work, and you'll see why. You can see here on the right that if you try and put in a double flare into a bubble flare fitting, that usually the nut will bottom out before it forces the end against the mating surface. And in this case you can see that the mating surfaces are obviously not meant to come together. Typically when you try and do this, if you tried to screw that inverted double flare down into a bubble flare fitting, you'd bottom out the nut, but the tube would still be loose. You could pull it up and down maybe a 1/16 or 1/8 of an inch. It would not get tight in there. There are fittings, adapters available to where you can take a 3/8 times 24 female that's intended for an inverted double flare. You could screw this fitting into your metric caliper, wheel cylinder, whatever, and then you could screw in your typical SAE nut with an inverted flare on top of that. This might be something you would do if you only owned an inverted double flare kit and you didn't want to mess around with going out and getting a bubble flare kit. So you would first put the adapter into your wheel cylinder, master cylinder, caliper, and then you would screw in the standard SAE nut with an inverted double flare on it. Here's a picture of a typical brake line running over to a wheel cylinder. And you can see on that 3/16 line, for a portion of the length, it's covered with a spiral wrap. That's called a gravel guard. The gravel guard is used where the line may be exposed to gravel thrown up from one of the wheels, so that wrap will protect it from any damage. It's somewhat optional if you want to use this or not, but here's a picture of some that's available. Alright, we've got this broken brake line. We're going to come down under the car. It was connected here with that bracket. We're going to pick a spot a little past that bracket that's nice and straight section where we can get our cutter in there and our flaring tool. When I tried to loosen this clamp here and bend this first brake line down to cut it, I tried to cut it back here, but it started leaking right there at that fitting. So we're going to take a little bit longer, going to have to go back in up to here. So definitely get a little extra brake line and inspect these types of places here. You can see the heavy rust on the other brake line. It's probably not far behind in braking, but we'll worry about that later. Okay, I've acquired the arsenal of brake line repair tools, fittings and such. I've got a 51-inch length of copper nickel 3/16 inch brake line. We're going to use an inverted flare, which is also called double flare. That's the coupling. We've got some nuts, some short ones, some long ones. For the brake line itself, that was a metric thread, so it took some different nuts there. These are metric. We've got the bender, which is about as cheap as you can get, and we probably won't even use it because it doesn't bend very tight. Then we've got the double flaring tool. Both the double flaring tool and the bender I just loaned from AutoZone. And there's this little die here that's going to help us make the double flare. In the brake line, these metric fittings, those are not a double flare, those are a bubble flare. And from what I've figured out, a bubble flare is basically the first step of making an inverted flare. You just don't drive the cone down in there, which is the second step. So you just put this little die in there, squeeze it down, and it makes a bubble flare on the end of that line. And that's what'll go in the brake line side. But then in the coupler, we're going to use a double flare, which is basically what this is right here. So what you want to do is, if you can get the brake line out in the same shape that it was in there, that'd be great. Mine actually broke there, so it's in two pieces. But the real complicated part's up here. So we're just going to bend the new one in the shape of that, put the metric fitting on this end, and then we'll put the double flare fitting on the other end, and then we'll double flare the existing steel line that's on the car right now, and we'll couple them together with this inverted flare / double flare coupler. I found some good videos on YouTube that show how to make a double flare, so I'm not going to show that. Go out and search. You'll find how to do it. It's pretty easy once you have this tool. I'm just bending this 3/16 inch copper nickel brake tubing by hand. Just kind of bend it around a broom handle to make this first, which is the most complicated bend. And we'll go on from there. This is the brake hose side. Has the metric fitting on there. And again, just a bubble flare, which is the first step of making a double flare. The line that's dripping there, that's the one that goes up the master cylinder. And this one here is my new line. You're going to want to go ahead and put your double flare on the one that goes to the master cylinder first. In case you screw it up, you can cut it shorter and you'll still have plenty of new line. At this connection here, we're going to use a coupling, and we're going to double flare both sides, both pipes here, then screw them together in a coupling. Yeah, that extra length comes in handy, especially if you do something stupid like forget to put the nut onto the tube first. So now I got to cut off my nice double flare, slide the nut on, and do it again. Got that coupling all screwed together. Got all the supports put back on. Back in the back here, you're going to want to make sure that that brake line doesn't get smacked by this rear axle assembly as it bounces up and down on the springs here. So you want to make sure you got plenty of clearance in there. There's also a muffler pipe there, so keeping it away a little bit from that.